Let the sun shine. 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 Let the sun shine.
Hey, what's going on over there? How are you tonight?
I'm well.
What's going on? I'm so happy to have you, my one and only Martha's Vineyard Frenner heads up game player.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I am doing well considering COVID-19.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. How's everything up in Washington Heights? We'll let some people get on before we get started. What's happening up in Washington Heights tonight?
Well, you know, there are people on the street like it's a regular summer day.
Right. Okay. I know.
Yeah, people are like, oh, let me put my mask on.
Yeah, it's a lot of that.
I can see all of that activity from my window.
Yeah. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Cecil, Sham, James. What's happening with you guys tonight? We have the one and only Nikita Stewart, who is a reporter for the New York Times. She covers social service for the New York Times, which is beat writer. In 2018, she won. In 2018, the New Women's Club of New York recognized her coverage for homelessness, mental health, and poverty. She also was a finalist of the Livingston Award as an investigative reporter and Editors Award. She contributed to the Times landmark 1619 project. I think you guys heard about that project. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, which she won a special Polk Award. She also joined the New York Times in 2014, where she was previously at the Washington Post. So welcome to the show, Nikita. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good. Thank you guys for coming on board. Hey, Tracy, how you doing? What's up, Davis? What's up, Cornelius? So let's just start out. Give us your story. Where are you from? What's your background? What college you went to? All that good stuff.
So, wow. I am from Killeen, Texas.
Yeah.
Killeen, Fort Hood. My family was Army. And so I was raised on Fort Hood and Fort Clayton in Panama, moved back to Fort Hood. My parents actually met at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, where I ended up moving to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and went to high school there and went to college there. I went to Western Kentucky University.
Okay.
I majored in journalism and pledged Alpha Kappa Alpha, to throw that in there.
All right.
And yeah, that's
your story.
pretty much it.
When was your love for journalism? When did you recognize that you wanted to do journalism?
Oh, very early. My brother had a paper route.
Okay.
And I used to help him each morning. The newspapers would come to the house, and this was back in the day. You didn't have bags. If your paper got wet, it got wet. But we did put rubber bands on them. You know, you fold them, put rubber bands on them. And, you know, I was working for free. So I took my time sometimes and read the paper instead.
Right.
And, you know, I was just like, wow, this happened last night and it's in the paper today, which is like something really silly to think about now.
Right.
But I was just like, oh, how does that happen? And then when I was in the 6th grade, there was a career fair, and a reporter from the local paper, she came and talked, and she talked about how every day was different. And I was like, I'm doing that. And
Right.
so that's what I've been doing like since I was in the 6th grade.
All right. How did you end up at the Washington Post?
Oh, well, it's funny because whenever I'm talking to students, I tell them, you know, look around the room, because if you're going to stay in this business, and even if you go into another profession, you're going to end up seeing these people again. And so when I was in high school, I was in several summer journalism programs, but I was also in one at Northwestern.
Okay.
And there weren't very many people of color in the camp.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one Black male student. And so we stayed in touch through the years. He was from New York. Here I was, Texas, Kentucky, my accent. But we both had a love of journalism. And
Okay.
so he and I were in New York at the same time. Right after we were like getting started in our careers in journalism. And then he later went on and he ended up at the Washington Post.
Okay.
And I was at the Star Ledger in New Jersey at the time. And so I remember he reached out to me and he was like, hey, the Washington Post was asking me, do I know any journalists they should be looking at? And I put your name in. And I was like, okay. And so then I got a call from the Washington Post like right away. And it turned out that some editors were going to be in New York for a conference and said, you know, can you come by the hotel, talk to us, blah, blah. So I went and, you know, that talk led to my getting a job at the Washington Post. And I was there for 9 years.
Okay. Fast forward, you got to the New York Times. You're now a beat writer, working as a Metro writer, beat writer, and doing social services. How did that come about?
Well, I have spent most of my career covering politics and political corruption.
Okay.
So social services is a little different.
Right.
And so when I got to the New York Times, I just thought, okay, I'll just be covering de Blasio. I'll be at City Hall. And I did that for a year or so. But I was also being tapped by the national desk to kind of go into, you know, when there were big events.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those was the tragic death, killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore.
Okay.
And with that story, I wasn't the breaking news reporter. I was supposed to do like a deep dive. And I ended up doing a deep dive with some of my colleagues on just his neighborhood and the poverty of the neighborhood. Mm. And the Times hadn't had a reporter covering social services in New York for a while. And an editor saw that one story that I wrote and was like, oh, wow. Do you think Nikita would want to cover social services? And so some editors took me to lunch and we talked about it, including the student who I told you about from Northwestern. It turns out that he was now an editor and he was going to be over social services and I would be his reporter. It was the first time we had worked together at the Washington Post. Okay. It was the first time like he was going to be my boss. It's like, okay, this is going to be interesting. But no, it turned out great.
Okay.
And, he's actually not at the Times anymore. Now he's at ProPublica, but you know, it's been a very fulfilling beat and like the best career move I never saw coming.
Okay. Well, let's fast forward because I want to get to your book. We have Nikita Stewart, who is the author of Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in a shelter and inspired the world. She's also a New York Times beat writer. But before we talk about the book, there was one other major project that you were on, which was the 1619 Project, which was a major write-up with Nicole Hannah-Jones, the award-winning investigative reporter. How did that come about, and how long did that project take for you guys to write that?
Woo! Well, Nicole was the brainchild. She is a dear friend of mine. And I remember she was on book leave, and she was going to be coming off book leave, and I was at her house, and I remember her saying, yeah, well, the story I'm pitching, you know, I think we really need to recognize 1619. And I was like, whoa, okay. But, you know, and I got invited to a brainstorming session. And I tell you, I left that brainstorming session thinking, oh, I'm going to write about food. Right. But it turns out when I was talking to Nicole at her house, I was telling her about how I had just learned more about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was, he was, there was a big age gap between my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. And
Mhm.
so he was enslaved.
Right.
And, you know, it turns out that he had been interviewed, and his interview was in the Library of Congress, and I was talking to her about it. So after, once they were deciding exactly how the 1619 Project was going to shape up,
Mhm.
Nicole and an editor approached me and asked me, well, can you write an essay about how enslavement is taught in
Okay.
schools? And I was like, okay, I can handle that. And then they were like, and you know, do you think you would want to talk about your great grandfather? And I was like, oh,
Wow.
okay.
Wow. Mhm.
Can I do that? Because it ended up being very emotional for me.
Mhm.
But now I'm just, it was such a landmark project. And
Right.
like, I can't believe I was able to like put my great grandfather's words and the way I interpret them
Mhm.
in writing for like um, children, for students, for adults all over the world to read. The response was incredible. And of course, Nicole's essay, which just won the Pulitzer Prize. I remember when I read it, I sent her a message. I was like, "Oh, girl, you make me want to wave an American flag." I'm still just so proud of her and so honored that she and the editors included me in the project.
How long did it? How
And
long
Mary Elliott and I were in the same section. So
All right.
that's exciting.
Yes, Mary, that's my girl. That's my girl, curator at the National African American Museum in DC. How long did a project like that take to write? I mean, what was the whole length of the time from when she started that to when it actually got published?
I mean, she came back at the beginning of the year, and then you know it was published in August. So
Okay.
there were months. But you know, I say that, but everyone knows that when you have a big story like that or a big project like that, you know, you can say you started on it on this day, but no, Nicole had started on this years
Here.
ago.
Right.
She was in high school and she first saw the date 1619. So trust and believe this was based on years of research, even if it, you know, didn't actually start until
Right.
the beginning of the year.
Okay, well, let's shift and talk about why you're here tonight. We have Nikita Stewart, author of the book Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in the shelter and inspired the world. It's such an inspiration and such an inspiring book. You put your heart out into it. You can tell. Basically, to be prepared, you know, that's the motto of the Girl Scouts, right? So, however, in Queens, which a lot of people don't know, in Queens there are over 60,000 homeless people that are in shelters throughout the city. It might even be more than that. That's just in that borough of Queens. But you talk about the story of Gazelle and her daughters that start the first ever Girl Scout troop in a homeless shelter. Talk about that and how did that come about?
Well, you know, I have to actually go back to 2015 when
Okay.
the editors were like, Nikita, would you like to cover social services? And I was like, okay, let me take this on. And so when you're starting a new beat, you want to go to as many places as possible, meet as many people as possible. And so I got an invitation to a Thanksgiving lunch at a shelter. So it's like, okay, I'm going to go. You know, I'm not going to write a story. I'm just going to go so I can observe, so I can get inside a shelter. It's very difficult to get inside shelters.
Mhm.
You have to have permission,
Yeah.
or not have permission and figure out how to get in.
Yeah.
Another story.
We used to do-
But anyway,
Yeah.
you know, so I showed up and I was surprised because there were all these Girl Scouts there serving the Thanksgiving lunch. And I was like, oh, well, you know, it's sweet. And I tell you, I was moved. I was a little teary eyed and I was like, oh my goodness.
Right.
And, you know, I glanced across the room, and I was like, well, aren't these Girl Scouts cute? What I didn't realize is that, you know, one of those troop leaders and her daughters were at that moment on the verge of homelessness.
Okay.
And so it really hit home for me once I met them again in 2017, and it turned out that they were the ones starting the troop in the shelter, that they, in fact, you know, full-time job, had an apartment, just evictions,
right,
being evicted, having been unemployed previously, having medical bills. Giselle has epilepsy.
So just life.
Just caught up. I mean, you know, you're in real estate. It's tough out here.
Yeah.
But it also shouldn't be a city where it can't just be for rich people, right?
Right.
So, in early 2017, most of my stories were dealing with the conflict and controversy surrounding the opening of new shelters.
Okay.
And so at the time, Mayor de Blasio had announced that he wanted to open 90 new homeless shelters all around the city. People were not happy
right
at all. They were like, I don't want a homeless shelter in my neighborhood. My property value is gonna fall.
Right, all of that.
Right. And so I was dealing with those stories, and you know, it was just a lot. And so as soon as I heard about this Girl Scout troop in a shelter, I was like, whoo, that is like a respite from what I've been writing. So it was like, okay, I'm jumping on that right away.
How did that come about? How did they come about starting a Girl Scout troop in a shelter?
Well, so the troop leader I saw, Giselle Burgess, in 2015, who became homeless, she had a job at the Girl Scouts.
Oh, okay.
And so when she was in the shelter, she realized, like, why can't I start a Girl Scout troop here? And she reached out to people in the Girl Scouts of Greater New York, and it turns out that they were already thinking of something. They didn't know quite. Weren't quite sure how that would work. They just knew they wanted to get involved somehow in the lives of particularly women who were in shelter. But this was just one of those things where, you know, no one would ever want to be homeless. But had she not been in that shelter, I'm not so sure Troop 6000 would be here in the form that we see today.
How did the name come about, Troop 6000?
Oh, well, in New York, the troop names or the troop numbers correspond to your borough. So it's the 1000s, 2000s, 3000s, 4000s, 5000s.
Oh, okay. For the 5 boroughs. Okay.
Right. But this troop, when they were trying to decide, okay, well, what are we going to name it? And we're like, well, you know, Giselle at first, she was like, well, let's name it the zip code of the shelter. And we're like, well, no, that's not going to work. And so someone realized, okay, years ago, they used to use like the 6000s for specialized troops, but it's not used anymore. And we're like, what about just Troop 6000? Because in fact, you know, these girls don't necessarily belong anywhere at this moment in their lives.
Okay.
And so it's basically this borough that's kind of floating around us.
Right.
I was telling you.
It's kind of one of those things where they don't have a home, and since they don't belong to any of the boroughs, they belong to this auxiliary club per se. It's an interesting thing because, I mean, homelessness is such a problem, and we can only imagine what homelessness is going to bring after, you know, post-COVID or even during COVID, because you can see right now, the only good part about that is there are no eviction clause current right now with the city. But as soon as that gets lifted, there's going to be a lot of people it's going to be a problem, and especially with the tax situation and the people leaving New York City. And the budget deficits that we're having, it's just going to be quite, an obstacle for us to face. Now, Gazelle started this Girl Scout troop because she wanted to give her girls, a regular day of, just like the life of a girl, because she felt like a little girl, because she felt as though they were growing up too fast and having to become adults. Did that rectify that situation for her? I mean, how did the girls take on being a member? Were they well received? What were some of the challenges that they faced?
Well, in forming the troop, Giselle had to recruit girls and recruit volunteers, which wasn't that easy because remember that this was a homeless shelter, and you have parents who are dealing with, I'm trying to figure out how to get out of shelter. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to afford this Metro card to get to work. I got to pick my kids up. My kids are in new school. They're just like all these things. People are like, okay, this is cute. I'll take your flyer, but I don't know.
Right.
But, that very first meeting, she had 8 girls, including her 3 daughters.
Okay.
And, through word of mouth, people started looking in they met in the breakfast room, like a little dining area where, because this hotel, it was a budget hotel.
Okay.
And this used to be like the buffet area, if you will.
Okay.
And people would see them like, oh, they're Girl Scouts. Okay, what's this about? And the troop just kept growing. And by the time I showed up, they were, celebrating, and, they had just celebrated 1 month. It was exciting for them. Like, we made it a whole month and we have more girls.
Right. Now, did you ever live in the shelter with them? Did you ever spend the night in the shelters?
I never spent the night. One of the things that was important to me was I never wanted to get anyone in trouble.
Okay.
When I set out to report the book, I wanted to make sure I had everyone's permission. So I had to talk to the Girl Scouts. I had to talk to the Department of Homeless Services. They were like, okay, so you can be in the hotel for like all the meetings. I'm like, perfect. But,
Okay.
I didn't want to, I didn't want to mess anybody up, and I didn't want to mess up my access.
Right. Okay.
But one of the things that I did was, the parents were great about, and even the kids, giving me photos, videos, so
Oh.
I could see exactly what's going on upstairs. Tell me what's going on upstairs.
Right. So in this particular hotel, how many people were in the hotel? I mean, in this homeless shelter hotel.
Well, I'm trying to remember because there were like, I'm trying to remember. There were like 120. I'm trying to remember exactly what those numbers were. There were a lot. It was definitely.
Were the girls that were in this Girl Scout troop from just that hotel, or were they from
just
other?
that hotel? And that will tell you. At the beginning, you were talking about how many people are homeless and in shelters. So there are about 79,000 to 80,000 people who are homeless.
Right.
By the definition of the city.
Right.
In New York, in all of New York. Now, the majority of the people are in shelter. And the majority of those people are families with children. And so you have about 23,000 children who are in shelters around the city. Now, that only counts the main shelter system. That doesn't count the private shelters, the shelters for victims of domestic violence.
Right.
There are a lot more kids. Plus, the federal definition that the schools follow, children who are living in doubled up and tripled up situations are also considered homeless, which they are. I mean,
right, because you don't have the room.
Your name's not on the lease,
right?
Or, you know, you could be kicked out at any time. This is an unstable situation. So when you start adding that up, there are 114,000. There were 114,000 homeless students.
I know, yeah.
Last year, and that does not count their younger brothers and sisters. You got to wrap your head around this.
Right. One thing that you brought up right there, which is why a lot of people don't understand why they didn't close the school so early in New York, because you have 1 million kids in New York that go to school in New York. You have 1 million public school kids. Of that million, 10% or a little bit more are homeless. So they had to work out a plan basically on how to feed those kids, because those kids basically go to school for meals. And a lot of people don't realize that, because they think, oh, kids going to school. They don't realize how many people are homeless in this city. I used to sit we used to do a homeless shelter. So I used to stay overnight with the guys from our church, and we would go in and we would feed them their meal. They'll come in, talk about their stories. We'll give them a meal, but then we would go on this side and they would be on that side of the gymnasium that they had in Brooklyn. So it's a very interesting situation. And then in the morning they would get up, we feed them breakfast, and then they go to work. So a lot of homelessness in New York, it's not like they're not working. They're working and got full-time jobs. It's just that they can't afford a place to live because the city is just too expensive.
Right.
So for the girls themselves, what did they get the full activities of a Girl Scout? Did they do all the stuff like selling Girl Scout cookies and all that kind of stuff?
Well, okay. So in the beginning, the cookies were an issue because, you know, it's like, well, how are we going to sell cookies? We got to go door to door in the shelter. They're not going they're not going to have that. And no, it's not going to work. And so it wasn't until a year later when the truth had spread to other shelters that they, you know, came up with this plan and put it into action of selling Girl Scout cookies at a Kellogg's restaurant in Union Square. And the word of mouth was tremendous. And the line was around the corner. I mean, the girls thought, okay, we might sell a few cookies. This could be embarrassing. We've been saying all this time we want to sell cookies. We're about to sell 2 boxes. And boy, they sold more than 32,000 boxes of cookies. So
wow, that's impressive.
They did very well.
It's just impressive. So everybody who just joined us, we got Nikita Stewart. She is the author of Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in a shelter and inspired the world. Which is major. The shelter was in Queens in a sleepless hotel. That was it called? Sleep in hotel. Okay. We know New York City is broken. The homelessness, at-risk kids. We know marginalized kids are all facing a tough time, especially during this time. It's an inspiring story that you wrote about that. Just your writing and just realizing that when you actually became a part of that, what was the major takeaway that you felt and that you wanted to get across in your book with these young girls?
Well, you know, when I first decided that I was going to write a book, I really thought I was going to be writing about homelessness and housing through the eyes of Girl Scouts. I was like, okay, this is my chance to, like, you know, talk about homelessness, but like put it in the pretty bow of a Girl Scout, right? But what I learned over my year of reporting was that this wasn't necessarily just about homelessness and the lack of affordable housing and about poverty. This was about this need for community and this sense of belonging and wanting to be part of something that's bigger than yourself. And helping your community. We're talking about people who, this was like one of the worst things to happen to them.
Right.
And yet they found the strength and the camaraderie to like come together and build the Girl Scouts, this Girl Scout troop in a shelter.
Right.
It's absolutely amazing. And it continues because people do still want to be part of something. And this also made it easier because, I know that maybe there are parents watching right now, and you know how it is trying to get your kids from, to ballet, and I got to get to karate and, whatever. It's a lot of work going
Right.
back and forth. And so you're already under the stress of, trying to find housing. So
Right.
with this, the meetings were in the shelter, and that made it easier for parents and their children to participate.
Right.
And then they like ended up going on fabulous field trips, which, and now each site, the volunteers, the troop leaders, who are also parents,
Mhm.
who are in the shelters, they come up with their own, programs and itineraries. They've really been given ownership of
Right.
their site.
They've really created a community within the shelter for the girl. So therefore, it really gives them an activity to really keep them out of trouble too, and also too, as you stated, for the moms to really keep their minds free of the stresses of every day trying to find housing in New York City. When you see something such as that, what did it do? I know the hardships that they had, but then also too, in the book you talk about they had they gained notoriety from this. And from gaining notoriety from this, it also was kind of like a double-edged sword. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Just think they're going to, fancy dinners, and I mean, this celebrity and that celebrity, and ooh, I did this, I was in VIP, and then you go home to the shelter and you're just like, what is going on here?
Right.
And Giselle used to say, boy, people want to give us backpacks, they want to give us all these different things, but nobody's passing out housing. And so
The most thing I read.
to always remember that, and to always, so there's a roller coaster of emotions that people will read in the book, and I think sometimes we forget about that when we see these Cinderella stories on TV.
Mhm.
You forget, like, okay, well, what happens when the cameras are gone?
Right.
And when the cameras are gone, like, I still can't pay my bills. I'm still living in the homeless shelter. So.
Right. How did the young girls handle the situation?
Well, it depended on the age, because the younger ones, they didn't necessarily, they're like, okay, I don't know exactly what's going on. I just know that I like going places. This is fun. The older girls, they were more understanding, like, okay, some of them were like, okay, I want to be at this meeting. I love the Girl Scouts, but I'm also like, I need to help my mom, my dad try to find housing.
The pressure. Growing up real fast in New York City. People don't realize that. I mean, it's just this city brings on a lot of social ills, and it highlights a lot of social ills, especially during this pandemic. So I can only imagine where today, that was back in 2017. Is Gazelle and her daughter still in the shelter? Or are they in housing now? Where are they?
They are in housing. And the thing is, last night I was in a virtual event with them, and obviously they're in their house, and I'm like, surprise, spoiler alert, they get out of the shelter. But so many things happened even after they found housing that will show you just how precarious life is. You never know what's going to happen. And there are so many people who are still just one paycheck, two paychecks away from all of it falling apart.
Right. How did she make it out? How did she make it out?
Well, there's a whole chapter. I don't want to spoil the book for people. But there was so in shelters around the city, there are people called housing specialists. Now, you know, some are good. They're just like real estate.
Not this one.
Some are good.
Some are good, some are bad. You're right. You're right.
I can do bad by myself. I don't need you. But in this case, Giselle had dealt with other housing specialists. But there was a housing specialist who came along. His name was Roger, and he made it happen for her. And he, there are these, people in the book who are just on a couple of pages. They kind of like pop up, and he's one of them. And like the people who kind of pop up are some of my favorite people in the book, because it just goes to show that you just need like that one person to just give you the little help that you need, and you never know who it's going to be.
Do you think the girls are okay when it comes down to how they envision life and what they see about life and stuff like that? What's your observation of the girls today with that experience that they had in the shelter?
I think what's good about the Girl Scouts is that being a part of Troop 6000, it exposed them to so much. Sometimes it's all just about that exposure, like knowing that there's something else.
Right.
I know growing up, especially with getting into journalism, my family, I didn't have a lot of money. But just being a part of those journalism programs and being able to see another side, to report another side, it's like, oh, okay, see, okay, that's what's going on over there. Okay, how do I get from A to B? And I can see a lot of that happening for the girls. Like, because there are so many people who want to have programs for the girls, that they're being exposed to so many things. Like, okay, I can go to college. Okay, I can do this, do that. This is who I need to talk to.
Do you think your experience growing up allowed you the insight to humanize them? Because you paint a good picture of them. You paint such a beautiful picture throughout the book of humanizing them and not making them feel like marginalized people. Do you believe your upbringing helped you write that story?
Yes, and I'm not going to cry tonight, Charlie.
I'm sorry.
But growing up, I was that kid who I didn't want to pick up my free lunch card because I didn't want anybody to see me pick up my free lunch card. When my mom pulled out that book of stamps, like, so I knew that feeling, and I could see the girls and who felt embarrassed and uncomfortable and who didn't. And then I witnessed, a change in all of them. And it made me have a better understanding that it's okay to talk about that.
Right. It's not,
and because it's more people than you think. And I saw them take, like, Troop 6000 is a badge of honor. It's like, yep, Troop 6000 for the older girls. Like, yep, Troop 6000 means that I lived in a shelter, or I live in a shelter, and you know what?
Look at me now.
There are other girls who are just like me, and also a troop is a troop.
Right.
I'm a Girl Scout just like you.
Right.
It doesn't matter. You might have more money than me. You might be in a housing situation, but that could change just like that.
Right. Wow. Wow. I love it. I think it's so inspirational. You guys out there, if you want something to read during this here you go quarantine time, it's definitely a good read. I haven't finished it all. I have to be honest, but when I started, I was like, "Ooh, this is so good! It's so juicy." But it's so, I mean, like you say, those pop-up characters, even with Zale in the beginning with her boyfriend, Wally, and how, they went to Florida thinking they were going to have a better life and then coming back. And then when they went back, the house was destroyed. So just one obstacle after another, you just highlight that and you really just bring it home for people to really experience, to start to see from the beginning. It's just one obstacle after another obstacle after another obstacle. So that's why I want you to kind of like say, okay, where the girls are today, and what they're doing. You also stated that Gazelle kind of got caught up in her own respectability politics a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
So,
she wanted to be like, well, we have to be perfect. And, she didn't want anyone to look down on them.
Mhm.
And, then, she evolved like, oh no, you're not going to treat me like this. Oh, no,
Right.
no. That's not how
Mhm.
this is going to work. And once you read the book, you'll see how she does that 180 on that attitude. I mean, it is amazing. And, I'm not supposed to be political, but she is running for city council in Queens.
I love it. Yes. Yes.
So that's just amazing. Like, I went to her house one day and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm studying." I was like, "What are you studying?" She was like, "Parliamentary procedure." But I was like, "Where are you studying all that?" She's like, "I'm running for city council." I was like, "Girl, shut up." I was like, "This is amazing."
I love it. I love it. That is such a wonderful. What is your I guess what is your favorite chapter in the book that you wrote about?
Well, I'm saying I love every chapter. You should read every chapter.
Uh-huh.
But the very first chapter actually almost didn't end up in the book.
Really?
Yeah.
It's such a good, I think it gets you started,
Listen, the thing is, like, I kept holding on to that and onto that moment and that scene.
Yeah.
And but it didn't quite fit chronologically, blah blah blah. And so it was like left on the cutting room floor. And then once I like turned in a draft,
Mhm.
the editors were like, "I don't know, it just feels like something's missing." I was like, "What?" And I was like, and then at that moment I was like, you know what? I gotta go with my gut.
Right.
And what do I think is missing?
Right.
And it ended up being the opening of the book, and I love it. So that's one of my favorite chapters. I also love Man Enough to Be a Girl Scout, because people think it's about one man, but it's actually about two men.
Mhm.
And so you'll read that. I love Ugly Christmas Sweater, and you'll see that because I love the surprise of Ugly Christmas Sweater.
Okay.
They're like, I have heard people describe it as a page turner, and I'm glad I was able to achieve that. Everybody has their opinions, but I did tried to write it in a way where, when you read that chapter, you're like, okay, no, what's going to happen next?
Right.
And I had to set it up in that way. I mean, it's largely chronological.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but it made sense. You had to go that way because you had to make the story see where they were going. You could skip ahead in some places, but you really had to come back to tie it all in. Have you ever thought about turning the book into a movie?
I can stay tuned.
Good answer. Well, we know what that means. Okay. What's next for you?
Well, I have a job at the New York Times. I'm still covering social services. So I am continuing to write stories about people who are experiencing homelessness, unfortunately, children who are also experiencing abuse, people who are hungry. You'll read those stories in the coming weeks. I've been off for my virtual book tour, but I will be back next week.
Okay. Well, I'll have everybody have your book information out there. If you guys want to ask Nikita any questions, let me know before we take off here. What are one of the takeaways? What's the number one takeaway you want readers to get from your book?
Especially in this pandemic, I think we as a society have to remember that, sometimes you got to look out for your fellow man, your fellow woman, your fellow person. And if people who have little to nothing can do that for each other, certainly everyone else can.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for telling your inspiring story. Nikita Stewart of the New York Times, author of the book Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in the shelter and inspired the world. Thank you for being with us tonight. I welcome you when you bring your movie back to us, because I know it's going to be a good old movie.
And now I have no idea. Like, seriously, I have no idea.
Well, we would love to see it on the screen. So anyway, until next time, we see you. Thank you. And we will look for you in the New York Times.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Let the sun shine. Let the sun shine. Let the sun shine. Let the sun shine. Let the